Bobby Mitchell stopped mid-step, his weathered hand freezing on the solar panel adjustment wrench as desperate cries shattered the Wyoming wilderness silence. The sounds weren't from any native animal he knew. They carried a human-like anguish that made his Marine-trained instincts scream danger. What he discovered through the pine thicket wasn't a territorial dispute between predators. It was an 18-foot Burmese python slowly crushing the life from a gray wolf mother, her amber eyes streaming actual tears as she looked desperately toward a den where her pups waited for her return. Sarah Chen's radio crackled to life in the Federal Wildlife Office 200 miles away, her coffee cup clattering to the floor as an emergency report came through. Massive python sighting in Yellowstone vicinity. Immediate response required. The wolf's ribs cracked audibly under the python's coils, each labored breath weaker than the last, while somewhere in the rocks behind her, 3 helpless pups cried for their mother, who might never come home again. Bobby raised his tactical knife, knowing he had maybe 90 seconds before she suffocated. What happened next would either save 2 lives or cost him his own, but the real test of their impossible bond wouldn't come for 3 years, when bullets would fly and everything he thought he knew about loyalty would be shattered forever. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Robert Bobby Mitchell had never intended to become a hermit in the Wyoming wilderness, but grief has a way of driving men to unexpected places. At 54, the former Marine sniper carried himself with the quiet precision of someone who had learned to move through dangerous territory, though these days his only enemies were memories and the crushing weight of survivor's guilt that had followed him into these remote mountains 6 years ago. The 200-acre property had belonged to his grandfather, a taciturn rancher who had understood the healing power of solitude long before Bobby needed it himself. The off-grid cabin sat in a natural clearing surrounded by towering pines and rocky outcroppings, accessible only by a rough dirt road that discouraged casual visitors. Solar panels gleamed on the roof, and a small creek provided fresh water year-round. It was the kind of place where a man could disappear from the world entirely, which was exactly what Bobby had needed after burying his wife Catherine and 10-year-old son Daniel. The drunk driver who had taken his family had walked away from the collision without a scratch, serving only 18 months in minimum security before returning to his comfortable suburban life. Bobby had learned this detail during the sentencing hearing, sitting in the back row of the courtroom while his lawyer whispered about civil suits and monetary compensation. None of it had mattered. No amount of money could fill the silence in his house, couldn't replace the sound of Daniel's laughter echoing through the hallways or Catherine's gentle humming while she made breakfast on Sunday mornings. His Marine training had taught him how to compartmentalize trauma, how to function under pressure and complete missions despite overwhelming circumstances. But nothing in his military experience had prepared him for the particular emptiness that comes with losing your entire reason for living in a single moment. The nightmares weren't about enemy fire or combat zones. They were about ordinary Tuesday afternoons when he should have picked up Daniel from school, but had stayed late at work instead, about the thousands of small moments he had taken for granted and would never get back. The isolation suited him. He had learned to read the weather patterns in the mountain peaks, could track animal movements through the forest, and had developed an almost supernatural awareness of the wilderness rhythms around his property. Wildlife photographers occasionally hired him as a guide, drawn by his reputation for finding subjects that remained invisible to others. He preferred animals to people these days. They didn't offer empty condolences or suggest that he should move on or find closure, whatever that meant. This particular September morning had started like hundreds of others, with Bobby performing routine maintenance on his solar array, while the early autumn air carried the scent of pine needles and the distant promise of winter. He had been thinking about Daniel, wondering what his son would have looked like at 16, whether he would have inherited his mother's artistic talents or his father's practical nature. These were the kinds of thoughts that usually accompanied solitary work, the gentle melancholy that had become his constant companion. But today the wilderness had something else in store for him entirely. The desperate cries that had frozen Bobby in place grew more frantic as he followed them through the dense undergrowth, his military training automatically kicking in as he moved silently between the towering pines. Each step was calculated, deliberate, his senses hyper-aware of every sound and movement in the forest around him. The distress calls weren't coming from any animal he recognized. They held a quality of anguish that seemed almost human in their desperation, punctuated by weaker sounds that made his chest tighten with dread. When Bobby finally pushed through a thicket of serviceberry bushes into a small clearing, the scene that greeted him defied everything he thought he knew about the natural order of his mountain sanctuary. A massive Burmese python, easily 18 feet long and thick as a telephone pole, had wrapped its powerful coils around a gray wolf in what was clearly the final stages of a deadly embrace. The snake's prehistoric bulk seemed impossibly out of place in the Wyoming wilderness, its diamond-patterned scales gleaming in the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy above. But it was the wolf that shattered Bobby's heart completely. She was clearly a mother, her teats swollen with milk, indicating she had nursing pups somewhere nearby. More devastating still were the actual tears streaming down her gray muzzle as she looked desperately toward a cluster of rocks 50 yards away, where faint whimpering sounds revealed the location of her den. Her amber eyes held an intelligence and desperation that transcended species. This wasn't just an animal fighting for survival, this was a mother trying to get back to her babies who needed her. The python's coils tightened with methodical precision around the wolf's chest and hindquarters, each squeeze designed to compress her lungs and cut off her air supply. Bobby could see her ribs straining against the tremendous pressure, could hear the labored wheeze of her breathing growing weaker with each passing second. She had maybe 2 minutes before she would suffocate, leaving her pups orphaned and helpless in their den. Bobby's mind raced through possibilities as he assessed the situation with the tactical precision his Marine training had drilled into him. Shooting the python risked hitting the wolf, and the snake's death throes could crush her even if the bullet found its mark. His tactical knife was his best option, but getting close enough to cut through the python's coils meant putting himself within striking distance of both the panicked snake and a terrified wild predator. The wolf's struggles were growing visibly weaker, her movements becoming less coordinated as oxygen deprivation began to take its toll. Her eyes remained fixed on the distant den where her pups waited, and Bobby saw something in that gaze that reminded him powerfully of Catherine's face during Daniel's birth, the fierce, protective love of a mother who would die before abandoning her child. "Easy, Mama," Bobby whispered, his voice barely audible as he approached from the python's blind spot. "I'm going to help you." The wolf's amber eyes locked onto his, and something extraordinary passed between them in that moment, a communication that transcended language or species. She seemed to recognize that this human intended help rather than harm, and incredibly, she stopped struggling and conserved her remaining energy, somehow trusting that salvation had arrived. Bobby moved with the fluid precision that had made him an exceptional sniper, every motion calculated to avoid triggering the python's defensive reflexes. He grabbed the massive snake behind its triangular head with his left hand, feeling the incredible power in its muscular neck as it tried to turn and strike at him. With his right hand, he began sawing at the thick coils with his tactical knife, the razor-sharp blade designed for cutting through rope and canvas under battlefield conditions. The python thrashed violently, its massive body whipping through the air with enough force to break bones. But Bobby held on with grim determination. The coils were under such tremendous pressure that cutting through them was like trying to saw through steel cables stretched to their breaking point. Sweat poured down his face as he worked, acutely aware that every second counted in the wolf's rapidly diminishing window of survival. The blade finally penetrated deep enough to sever the first coil, and Bobby felt the python's grip loosen fractionally. Working with desperate efficiency, he managed to unwrap the remaining coils while the snake writhed in fury, its primitive brain focused now on escape rather than maintaining its death grip on its prey. As the last coil came free, the wolf collapsed to the forest floor, her sides heaving as she gasped desperately for air. The python, finally released from its commitment to the kill, slithered away into the dense forest with surprising speed, leaving behind only the acrid scent of fear and the sound of labored breathing gradually returning to normal. Bobby knelt at a respectful distance, watching as life slowly returned to the wolf's battered body, knowing that what happened next would determine whether this rescue had been worth the risk he had just taken. The wolf's recovery was gradual and painful to witness. Bobby remained motionless at the edge of the clearing, giving her space while monitoring her breathing and watching for signs of internal injury. Her ribs were clearly bruised, possibly cracked from the python's crushing embrace, and dark welts marked where the coils had compressed her gray fur. But she was alive, and as her breathing steadied, something remarkable happened that would change both their lives forever. Struggling to her feet with obvious difficulty, the wolf turned toward Bobby instead of fleeing deeper into the forest. Her amber eyes, still bright with unshed tears, studied his face with an intensity that felt almost human in its depth. Then, moving slowly and deliberately, she approached him and gently pressed her forehead against his chest, just above his heart. The gesture lasted only seconds, but Bobby felt the warmth of her breath, smelled the wild scent of pine and earth in her fur, and experienced a connection he hadn't felt since losing his own family. Without another look back, she limped toward the cluster of rocks where her den was hidden, disappearing into a crevice that Bobby hadn't even noticed from his position. Within moments, the forest filled with the soft sounds of reunion, little yips and whines as 3 pups greeted their mother's return, their voices high and sweet with relief and joy. Bobby gathered his equipment and returned to his cabin, his hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline rush of the encounter. He expected that to be the end of the story, a single moment of connection in the wilderness that he would carry as a treasured memory. But the wolf, it seemed, had very different ideas about their relationship. The next morning, Bobby discovered a freshly killed rabbit positioned precisely by his front door. The kill was clean and recent, still warm to the touch, placed with careful intention rather than dropped carelessly. He looked around the clearing surrounding his cabin but saw no sign of what had left this unexpected gift. The placement was too deliberate to be coincidental, too purposeful to be anything other than intentional communication. This pattern established itself over the following weeks with clockwork regularity. Every few days, Bobby would find fresh game on his porch. Rabbits, squirrels, occasionally fish from the nearby stream that ran through his property. The kills were always clean, never more than he could reasonably consume, and always positioned with the same careful precision by his front door. It was as if someone was making calculated payments for services rendered, ensuring the debt was properly acknowledged and honored. Bobby never accepted the meat, understanding instinctively that taking these gifts might disrupt whatever delicate balance was being established. Instead, he would move the offerings to the edge of his clearing where other wildlife could benefit from them, and began leaving fresh water in a large ceramic bowl near the tree line. The bowl was invariably empty by morning, creating a gentle cycle of mutual care that felt more like friendship than the typical relationship between human and wild animal. On the 4th day after the rescue, Bobby finally saw her again. The wolf sat calmly at the edge of his clearing in the early evening light, her gray coat blending almost perfectly with the shadows cast by the towering pines. When their eyes met across the distance, she seemed to dip her head slightly in a gesture that felt unmistakably like acknowledgment before melting back into the forest with the fluid grace that only wild creatures possess. As autumn progressed toward winter, these glimpses became more frequent and more intimate. The wolf would sometimes appear with her 3 pups, now grown into gangly adolescents with oversized paws and ears they hadn't quite grown into yet. Other wolves had joined them, forming what appeared to be a small pack, with Bobby's rescued wolf as the clear alpha female, her authority evident in the way the others deferred to her leadership and followed her lead. The pack's presence brought unexpected changes to Bobby's property that he began to notice and appreciate. Deer no longer destroyed his small vegetable garden, apparently deterred by the scent markers the wolves left around the perimeter. Bears gave his cabin a wider berth than usual, and he found himself with advance warning of approaching severe weather through the wolves' distinctive howling patterns that seemed to predict storms with remarkable accuracy. It was during one of these peaceful autumn evenings, as Bobby sat on his porch watching the pack interact in his clearing, that Dr. Marcus Whitmore made his first appearance in nearly 2 years. Bobby's old Marine buddy drove up the rough dirt road in a dusty SUV loaded with scientific equipment, his thin frame unfolding from the driver's seat with the same nervous energy Bobby remembered from their service days together. Marcus had always been the cerebral one in their unit, the soldier who approached problems with analytical precision rather than brute force. After leaving the Marines, he had pursued advanced degrees in wildlife biology and had built a respectable career studying predator-prey relationships in various ecosystems across the American West. His visits to Bobby's remote cabin had been infrequent but welcome, providing a connection to the outside world that didn't come laden with painful memories or unwanted sympathy. "Bobby, you old hermit," Marcus called out with forced cheer as he climbed the steps to the porch, his wire-rimmed glasses reflecting the last rays of evening sunlight. "I was in the area doing some research and thought I'd check in on you. How are you holding up out here in the middle of nowhere?" Bobby gestured toward the clearing where several wolves were visible in the gathering dusk, their gray forms moving like shadows between the trees. "Better than I expected, actually. I've got some interesting neighbors these days." Marcus's attention immediately sharpened, his scientific curiosity overriding social pleasantries as he observed the unusual scene. "Remarkable," he murmured, pulling a leather-bound journal from his jacket pocket and making rapid notes. Wolves don't typically establish territories this close to human habitation. This behavior is highly unusual, potentially groundbreaking from a research perspective. Marcus's initial visit stretched from a casual evening check-in to a 3-day intensive observation period that left Bobby feeling increasingly uncomfortable about his friend's true motivations. The wildlife researcher had transformed from the relaxed military buddy Bobby remembered into something resembling a predator himself, moving through the forest with calculated precision while setting up an elaborate network of trail cameras and motion sensors around Bobby's property. "This is unprecedented behavior," Marcus explained as he positioned yet another camera along one of the wolf pack's frequently used trails. "Wolves forming a protective relationship with a human settlement goes against everything we understand about their territorial instincts. The scientific community needs to document this phenomenon properly." Bobby watched his friend work with growing unease, noting how Marcus's questions had become increasingly specific about the wolves' daily patterns, their den locations, and their vulnerability during different times of day. What had initially seemed like legitimate scientific curiosity was beginning to feel more like surveillance, and Bobby's military-trained instincts were picking up subtle warning signals that something wasn't quite right about this sudden research interest. The bond between Bobby and the wolf pack had deepened considerably during the months following the python rescue. The alpha female, whom Bobby had privately begun calling Luna for her habit of appearing during moonlit evenings, had brought her injured youngest pup to him during a particularly harsh October storm. The young wolf had caught his paw in an old trap left by previous property owners, and Luna had somehow understood that the human who had saved her life might be able to help her offspring as well. Bobby had spent 2 careful hours cleaning and bandaging the pup's wound while Luna watched from just a few feet away, her amber eyes never leaving his hands as he worked. The level of trust required for a wild predator to allow a human to handle her injured young was extraordinary, and the successful healing of the pup had cemented a relationship that transcended normal boundaries between species. The pack had grown to 8 wolves by winter's approach, with 2 additional adults joining Luna's original family group. They had established a complex territory that encompassed Bobby's property as its center, with multiple den sites and hunting grounds radiating outward into the national forest. Bobby had become an honorary member of this extended family, recognized and protected by animals that would normally avoid human contact at all costs. Marcus's presence disrupted this delicate ecosystem in ways that became increasingly apparent as his visit extended. The wolves grew nervous and elusive, retreating deeper into the forest whenever the researcher appeared. Their usual evening gatherings in Bobby's clearing became rare, replaced by cautious observations from greater distances that suggested the pack recognized Marcus as a potential threat. "You're making them uncomfortable," Bobby finally confronted his friend on the 3rd evening as Marcus downloaded data from his trail cameras. "They were just starting to trust me completely, and now they're acting like they're being hunted." Marcus looked up from his laptop screen with the expression of barely concealed irritation. "Bobby, these are wild animals, not pets." The fact that they're avoiding proper scientific observation suggests they're operating on pure instinct, rather than the complex emotional attachments you seem to believe you've developed with them. The casual dismissal of Bobby's relationship with the pack struck him as not just wrong but deliberately cruel. These wolves had become his family in ways that Marcus clearly couldn't or wouldn't understand, filling the devastating emptiness that had consumed Bobby's life since losing Catherine and Daniel. To hear them described as merely wild animals operating on pure instinct felt like a fundamental betrayal of everything the past months had meant to him. Bobby's suspicions about Marcus's true intentions crystallized into alarm when he discovered that several of the trail cameras had been positioned not to study the wolves' behavior around his cabin, but to map their movements to and from their primary den site. The cameras were angled to capture clear images of individual wolves, with particular focus on Luna and her offspring. Even more disturbing was Marcus's detailed questioning about the pack's daily routines, their hunting patterns, and their vulnerability during different seasons. "Why do you need to know exactly where they sleep?" Bobby asked directly, confronting Marcus as he prepared to leave after his extended visit. "Your research is supposed to be about human-wolf interaction, not pack surveillance." Marcus's face tightened with annoyance at being questioned so directly. "Comprehensive behavioral studies require complete data sets, Bobby. You can't understand the anomaly of their relationship with you without understanding their normal behavioral patterns in the absence of human contact." But Bobby's military experience had taught him to recognize evasion and misdirection, and Marcus's explanation felt rehearsed rather than authentic. The cameras were positioned like reconnaissance equipment rather than research tools, and Marcus's interest in the wolves' vulnerability windows suggested purposes far removed from academic study. The truth began to emerge in fragments over the following weeks as Bobby conducted his own careful investigation into his friend's recent activities. Marcus's university funding had been cut dramatically the previous year due to budget constraints, leaving him with expensive equipment loans and research obligations he could no longer afford to fulfill. His academic career was hanging by a thread, and he was desperately seeking alternative funding sources to keep his research program viable. Bobby discovered this information through casual conversations with other researchers who knew Marcus professionally, painting a picture of a once respected scientist who had become increasingly desperate and ethically flexible as his financial situation deteriorated. There were whispers about Marcus accepting funding from questionable sources, and rumors that he had become involved with collectors who operated in legal gray areas of wildlife acquisition. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Bobby found a business card that had fallen from Marcus's equipment bag during his visit. The card belonged to a company called Apex Wildlife Acquisitions, which presented itself as a legitimate wildlife management firm, but which Bobby's internet research revealed to be connected to the exotic pet trade and private wildlife collections that operated outside normal legal oversight. Luna seemed to sense Bobby's growing anxiety about Marcus's involvement in their lives, appearing more frequently around his cabin and displaying protective behaviors that suggested she recognized the researcher as a threat to her pack's safety. She would position herself between Bobby and the forest whenever he was outside, as if guarding against dangers that might emerge from the wilderness that had become her domain. The situation reached a breaking point when Marcus returned unexpectedly in early December, this time accompanied by two other men who introduced themselves as research assistants, but who carried themselves with the professional wariness of people accustomed to handling dangerous situations. Their equipment included items that seemed more appropriate for capture operations than scientific observation, including heavy-duty tranquilizer guns and transportation cages sized for large predators. "I've found buyers for a comprehensive study," Marcus explained when Bobby questioned the new equipment and personnel. "Private collectors who are willing to fund long-term behavioral research in exchange for access to documentation of rare wolf behaviors. It's a win-win situation that will advance scientific understanding while providing the financial support needed to continue legitimate research." Bobby's blood ran cold as he realized what Marcus was actually proposing. The comprehensive study was cover for a capture operation that would remove Luna and her pack from the wild for the entertainment of wealthy collectors who treated endangered animals as living trophies. The months of surveillance had been preparation for an elaborate kidnapping scheme that would destroy the family Bobby had come to love while enriching the participants in what amounted to legalized wildlife trafficking. "You're talking about selling them," Bobby said quietly, his voice carrying the dangerous calm that his military unit had learned to recognize as a warning sign. "These wolves aren't research subjects, Marcus. They're my family." Marcus's expression shifted from false friendliness to something much colder and more calculating. "Your family?" He laughed harshly. "Bobby, you've lost perspective completely. These are wild predators who happen to tolerate your presence, probably because you've been feeding them regularly. You've anthropomorphized them to an unhealthy degree, projecting your grief over Catherine and Daniel onto animals that don't have the emotional capacity for the relationships you think you formed with them." The casual cruelty of using Bobby's dead family as a weapon in this argument revealed just how far Marcus had fallen from the principled person Bobby had once known and trusted. This wasn't just about money or career desperation. This was about a fundamental lack of respect for the bonds that had given Bobby's life meaning again after years of devastating isolation. "Get off my property," Bobby said quietly, his hand moving unconsciously toward the pistol he always carried in the wilderness. "Take your equipment, take your people, and don't come back." Marcus gathered his cameras and equipment with sharp, angry movements that suggested the conversation was far from over. "You're making a serious mistake, Bobby. With or without your cooperation, I know where that den is located. And I have buyers who pay extremely well for breeding pairs of wolves with documented behavioral anomalies." As Marcus and his associates drove away down the rough dirt road, Bobby understood that the confrontation had only postponed an inevitable conflict. Marcus had invested too much time and money in this operation to simply abandon it because of Bobby's objections, and the buyers, he had mentioned, would be expecting results regardless of the ethical implications of the capture operation. Luna appeared at the edge of Bobby's clearing that evening, her amber eyes reflecting the porch light as she studied his face with what seemed like concern. She approached closer than usual, close enough for Bobby to see the intelligence and awareness in her expression, and he realized that she somehow understood that danger was approaching her pack from the human world that Bobby represented. The attack came 3 weeks later on a moonless December night, when the temperature had dropped below freezing and the forest lay silent under a thin blanket of fresh snow. Bobby was awakened not by sounds of approaching vehicles, but by Luna's distinctive howl, a long, mournful call that carried notes of warning and desperate urgency that sent ice through his veins. He had learned to interpret the pack's various vocalizations over the months, but this was unlike anything he had heard before, filled with a terror that spoke of immediate and overwhelming danger. Bobby grabbed his rifle and night vision scope, moving to his bedroom window to scan the forest surrounding his cabin. What he saw made his blood run cold with fury and determination. 6 men in white winter camouflage were moving through the trees with military precision, carrying tranquilizer rifles and heavy netting equipment designed for capturing large predators. Marcus was among them, directing the operation with hand signals as they positioned themselves around the wolves' primary den site. The pack had already detected the intrusion and had formed a defensive perimeter around their den, but they were hopelessly outmatched by the sophisticated equipment and coordinated tactics of the capture team. Luna stood at the center of the defensive formation, her 3 grown pups flanked by the other adult wolves, all of them facing outward toward threats approaching from multiple directions simultaneously. Bobby dressed rapidly in dark winter gear and moved out of his cabin through the back door, using terrain features to approach the den site without being detected by Marcus's team. His military training kicked in automatically as he assessed the tactical situation, noting fields of fire, available cover, and the positioning of both the wolves and their human attackers. The capture team was using professional wildlife management techniques that would minimize injury to their targets while ensuring successful acquisition. They had positioned themselves to drive the wolves toward a natural bottleneck where nets could be deployed effectively, and their tranquilizer rifles were loaded with doses calculated to subdue large predators without causing permanent harm. This wasn't a crude poaching operation, it was a sophisticated capture mission planned and executed by people who knew exactly what they were doing. Bobby positioned himself on a rocky outcropping that gave him clear sight lines to the entire operation while keeping him concealed from the capture team. Through his rifle scope, he could see Marcus coordinating the final positioning of his men, his breath visible in the frigid air as he whispered instructions into a tactical radio headset. "Target acquisition in 30 seconds. Marcus's voice carried clearly through the still night air. "Remember, we need the alpha female alive and unharmed. She's the primary asset. The others are secondary priorities." The casual reference to Luna as an asset filled Bobby with a rage that transcended anything he had felt since the drunk driver's sentencing hearing. These people were discussing his family like livestock, reducing the wolves that had saved his sanity and given his life meaning to mere commodities in a business transaction. Bobby centered his rifle scope on Marcus and activated his weapon's laser sight, painting a red dot directly on his former friend's chest. "That's far enough," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. "Drop your weapons and step away from the wolves." The capture team froze, their heads swiveling to locate the source of the command while maintaining their grip on their tranquilizer rifles. Marcus raised his hands slowly, his face visible in the moonlight as he tried to locate Bobby's position among the rocks and trees. "Bobby, be reasonable about this," Marcus called out, his voice carrying a tone of forced calm. "These animals don't belong to you. They're wildlife resources that can contribute to legitimate scientific research while providing funding for conservation efforts that will benefit their entire species." "They're not resources," Bobby replied, keeping his rifle trained on Marcus while scanning for movement from the other team members. "They're family, and you're trespassing on private property with intent to commit theft." One of Marcus's men, apparently deciding that negotiation was pointless, raised his tranquilizer rifle toward Luna's position. Bobby's military reflexes took over without conscious thought, and he placed a precisely aimed shot that shattered the weapon in the man's hands without injuring him. The sound of the rifle shot echoed through the forest like thunder, immediately followed by the metallic clatter of the destroyed tranquilizer gun hitting the rocky ground. "The next shot won't be a warning," Bobby announced, working the bolt on his rifle to chamber another round. "You have 60 seconds to collect your equipment and leave my property." That's when Luna did something that would remain etched in Bobby's memory forever. Instead of fleeing from the gunshot and human voices as any normal wild animal would do, she tilted her head back and released a howl unlike anything Bobby had ever heard. It wasn't the warning call she had used to alert him to the intrusion. It was deeper, more complex, almost musical in its intensity, and seemingly designed to carry across vast distances. The howl was answered from all directions around the valley, creating a chorus of voices that seemed to emerge from the very landscape itself. Within minutes, wolves began materializing from the forest like gray shadows, moving with coordinated purpose toward the den site. Bobby counted at least 15 animals, including wolves he had never seen before, all converging on the location where Luna's pack was making their stand against the human intruders. Marcus's capture team found themselves surrounded by a pack that vastly outnumbered their 6-man operation, with wolves positioned on higher ground that gave them tactical advantages the humans couldn't counter. The animals didn't attack, but their message was unmistakably clear. Any aggression toward Luna's family would be met with overwhelming force from the extended pack that had answered her call for assistance. "This is impossible," one of Marcus's men whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the frigid air. "Wolves don't coordinate like this across territorial boundaries. They don't form alliances between separate packs." But Bobby understood what he was witnessing. How Luna had somehow communicated to every wolf in the surrounding territory that the den site contained not just her own family, but also the human who had become part of their extended pack structure. The response wasn't just territorial defense, it was family protection that transcended normal pack boundaries. Marcus's team began backing away nervously as the circle of wolves tightened around them, the animals moving with disciplined coordination that suggested intelligence and purpose far beyond normal predator behavior. The wolves weren't acting aggressively, but their presence made it clear that the capture operation had become untenable. "Stand down," Marcus finally ordered his team, his voice tight with frustration and defeat. "We're outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Collect the equipment and fall back to the vehicles." But as the capture team began to retreat, Marcus made a decision that revealed the true depth of his desperation and moral collapse. Instead of targeting Luna or her pack, he raised his tranquilizer rifle toward Bobby's position, apparently deciding that removing the human obstacle was the key to salvaging the operation. "If I can't have the wolves," Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the clearing, "at least I can remove the interference that's been protecting them." The tranquilizer dart was fired with professional accuracy, aimed directly at Bobby's center mass, and loaded with enough sedative to incapacitate a large man for several hours. But the shot never found its intended target. Luna moved faster than Bobby would have thought possible, leaving her position with her pack and covering the distance to Bobby's rocky outcropping in a series of powerful bounds that brought her between the human who had saved her life and the dart meant to neutralize him. The sedative struck her in the shoulder, and she collapsed at Bobby's feet within seconds, her amber eyes looking up at him with an expression that seemed to convey both love and farewell. The pack's response to seeing their alpha female fall was immediate and terrifying. The circle of wolves that had been maintaining disciplined positions around the capture team suddenly contracted with lethal intent, their defensive posture transforming into something that promised violence against anyone who threatened their family further. Marcus's men broke ranks and fled toward their vehicles, abandoning their equipment in their haste to escape the coordinated fury of 15 wolves who had just witnessed an attack on their leader. Marcus himself stood frozen for a moment, apparently shocked by the consequences of his actions, before joining his team in their panicked retreat through the forest. Bobby knelt beside Luna's unconscious form, checking her breathing and pulse, while the rest of the pack formed a protective circle around them both. The veterinary tranquilizer would wear off in a few hours, but she had taken a dose calculated for a human body weight, and Bobby wasn't certain how the medication would affect her system. As he carried Luna back toward his cabin, followed by her entire pack in solemn procession, Bobby realized that the wolf who had saved his life had also saved his soul, demonstrating a loyalty and love that he had thought he would never experience again after losing Catherine and Daniel. Luna survived the tranquilizer overdose, but the 12-hour vigil Bobby maintained beside her unconscious form was the longest night of his life since losing Catherine and Daniel. He monitored her breathing and temperature while 15 wolves maintained silent watch in his yard, their amber eyes reflecting the porch light as they waited for their alpha to recover. When she finally stirred at dawn, weak but alive, Bobby felt a relief so profound it brought tears to his eyes. But their victory was short-lived. 3 days later, federal wildlife agents arrived at Bobby's cabin with devastating news that shattered the fragile peace they had fought so hard to protect. Agent Sarah Chen, a serious woman in her early 40s with intelligent dark eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news, showed Bobby a series of photographs that made his blood run cold. "We arrested Dr. Marcus Whitmore and his associates yesterday," Agent Chen explained, spreading the images across Bobby's kitchen table. "But we were too late to prevent this." The photographs showed 3 young wolves in small, barren enclosures at what appeared to be a private facility. Bobby recognized them immediately. Luna's 3 pups, now fully grown but clearly distressed and confined in spaces barely large enough for them to turn around. Their eyes held the dull resignation of wild creatures who had been broken by captivity, their magnificent gray coats matted and their proud postures reduced to defeated slouches. "They were captured 6 months ago during your friend's first surveillance operation," Agent Chen continued, her voice gentle but relentless in its delivery of facts that destroyed Bobby's world. "Whitmore sold them to a private collector in Colorado before establishing the surveillance network around your property. The buyer paid $300,000 for the breeding trio." Bobby stared at the photographs, his hands trembling with a rage that threatened to consume his sanity entirely. While he had been enjoying Luna's visits and marveling at the pack's protective behavior around his property, her children had been suffering in captivity, torn from their family and reduced to exotic pets for someone wealthy enough to buy wild wolves like luxury items. "Where are they now?" Bobby asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Colorado facility has been shut down, but the wolves were transferred to another location before we could execute the seizure warrant," Agent Chen replied. "We're tracking them through Whitmore's financial records, but these networks are sophisticated. The animals could be anywhere in the country by now." The devastating news broke something fundamental in Bobby's relationship with Luna and the pack. When she appeared that evening for her usual visit, Bobby saw the knowledge in her amber eyes. She knew her children were gone, had probably known for months while continuing to trust and protect the human who had failed to save them. The guilt was overwhelming, a familiar weight that reminded Bobby of every time he had failed to protect the people he loved most. Luna approached him, as she always did, pressing her forehead against his chest in their traditional greeting. But Bobby pulled away. "I'm sorry," he whispered, unable to meet her eyes. "I should have protected them. I should have seen what Marcus was really doing." The wolf seemed to understand his anguish, remaining close but not forcing contact. Her presence a constant reminder of both the love they had shared and the children who had been stolen while Bobby was blind to the danger surrounding them. The media attention that followed Marcus's arrest brought unwanted scrutiny to Bobby's remote sanctuary. News crews arrived to film stories about the man who lived with wolves, turning the sacred relationship between Bobby and the pack into sensational entertainment for people who would never understand the depth of the bonds that had been formed and broken in the Wyoming wilderness. Worse still, the publicity attracted the attention of local ranchers who had long resented the protected status of wolves in the region. Led by a bitter rancher named Travis McKenzie, who had lost livestock to wolf predation the previous year, a group of local property owners petitioned federal authorities to relocate the pack away from Bobby's property, arguing that the concentration of wolves posed a threat to surrounding livestock operations. "These animals have become habituated to human contact," Mackenzie argued during a heated town hall meeting that Bobby attended reluctantly. "That makes them dangerous and unpredictable. They need to be removed before someone gets hurt." Bobby tried to defend the pack, explaining their protective behavior and their role in maintaining the ecological balance of the region, but his words fell on deaf ears. The ranchers saw only the wolves' predatory nature and the economic threat they represented to livestock operations that had been struggling with declining profits for years. Federal officials, overwhelmed by competing pressures from conservationists, ranchers, media attention, and the ongoing investigation into Marcus's wildlife trafficking network, decided that the simplest solution was to relocate the pack to a more remote area where they would have less contact with human populations. "It's for their own protection as much as anything else," Agent Chen explained during a private meeting with Bobby. "The media attention has made them targets for trophy hunters and collectors who see them as valuable specimens. Moving them to a protected wilderness area will keep them safe from future exploitation." But Bobby knew that relocation would destroy the pack structure that had taken years to establish. Luna's leadership was tied to the territory around his property, and forcing the wolves to establish themselves in unfamiliar terrain would leave them vulnerable to larger, established packs that would view them as invaders rather than neighbors. The final blow came when Bobby learned that Luna was pregnant again, carrying what would likely be her last litter given her age and the stress she had endured over the past months. The timing of the pregnancy meant that any relocation would have to wait until after the pups were born and weaned, but it also meant that Luna would be giving birth knowing that her new children would face the same uncertain future that had already claimed her previous offspring. Bobby made a decision that felt both inevitable and devastating. Rather than watch Luna suffer through another pregnancy while living under the constant threat of separation and relocation, he decided to leave the wilderness sanctuary that had been his refuge for 6 years. If he couldn't protect the wolves from the human world that seemed determined to exploit or displace them, at least he could remove himself as a factor in their ongoing persecution. The night before his planned departure, Bobby sat on his porch for what he expected to be the final time, watching Luna and her pack gather in the clearing as they had on so many peaceful evenings before Marcus's betrayal had shattered their world. The wolves seemed to sense that something fundamental was changing, their behavior more subdued than usual, as they maintained their vigil around the cabin. Luna approached him as she always did, but this time she didn't offer their traditional greeting. Instead, she sat beside his chair and leaned against his leg, her weight warm and comforting against his side. They remained like that for hours, watching the stars emerge over the Wyoming mountains, while both of them contemplated a future that held only separation and loss. When dawn broke over the mountains, Bobby loaded his truck with the few possessions he couldn't bear to leave behind. Photographs of Catherine and Daniel, his military medals, the tactical knife that had saved Luna's life during the Python attack. Everything else would remain in the cabin, ready for whatever future owner might appreciate the solitude and beauty of the remote mountain property. As Bobby drove down the rough dirt road for what he believed was the last time, Luna and her pack followed along the tree line, their gray forms moving parallel to his truck until they reached the boundary of the property. There, Luna stopped and sat beside the road, watching as the human who had saved her life disappeared from her world, just as her children had disappeared months earlier. In his rearview mirror, Bobby could see her silhouette growing smaller, until distance and tears made it impossible to distinguish her form from the landscape that had been their shared home. He was leaving behind the only family he had known since losing Catherine and Daniel, abandoning the wolves who had trusted him to protect them when he had proven incapable of keeping them safe from the human greed and bureaucratic indifference that threatened everything he had learned to love. The guilt was overwhelming, but Bobby told himself it was better this way. Luna and her pack would be safer without him, free from the human attention that had brought them nothing but tragedy and loss. 3 months after Bobby's departure from the wilderness sanctuary, Agent Sarah Chen called him at the small motel room in Billings where he had been living in self-imposed exile, surviving on his military pension and trying to forget the amber eyes that haunted his dreams every night. Her voice carried an excitement that cut through his depression like a blade, bringing hope he had taught himself not to feel. "We found them," she said without preamble. "Luna's missing pups. They're alive, and we know exactly where they are." Bobby's hands trembled as he gripped the phone, afraid to believe what he was hearing. "Where?" "A private estate outside Aspen, Colorado. The owner is a tech billionaire named Richard Castellanos, who collects rare animals like trophies. We've been building a case against him for months, and Marcus finally gave us the information we needed to obtain search warrants." The investigation had uncovered an extensive network of wealthy collectors who treated endangered animals as living status symbols, paying enormous sums to acquire wolves, big cats, and other predators that they kept in elaborate private zoos hidden from public scrutiny. Castellanos owned a 12,000-acre compound in the Colorado mountains where he maintained what he called his wilderness preserve, which was actually a sophisticated prison for dozens of illegally acquired animals. The 3 wolves are being held in a specially constructed enclosure designed to look natural, but actually prevent any possibility of escape, Agent Chen continued. "They're alive and physically healthy, but our behavioral specialists say they're showing signs of severe psychological trauma from prolonged captivity." Bobby closed his eyes, imagining Luna's children trapped in a gilded cage while wealthy visitors admired them like art objects. The rage that filled him was different from anything he had experienced during his military service. This was personal, focused, and absolutely uncompromising in its demand for justice. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. "We're organizing a coordinated raid to shut down Castellanos' operation and recover all the illegally held animals. But these wolves haven't had contact with humans they trust for months. We need someone they might remember, someone who could help calm them during the recovery process." Agent Chen explained that the raid would involve multiple federal agencies working together to penetrate Castellanos' security systems and document the extent of his illegal collection before safely extracting the animals. The operation was scheduled for the following week, pending final approval from federal prosecutors who were still building their case against the entire trafficking network. Bobby didn't hesitate. "I'm in." The flight to Colorado gave Bobby time to process the complex emotions surrounding this unexpected opportunity for redemption. He had spent 3 months convincing himself that leaving Luna and her pack had been the right decision, that his presence in their lives had brought them nothing but danger and tragedy. Now, he was being offered a chance to rescue the children whose capture had driven him into exile, to repair at least part of the damage his blindness had allowed Marcus to inflict. But he was also terrified of facing Luna's offspring after failing to protect them in the first place. Would they remember him? Would they associate him with the trauma of their capture? Or would they retain any memory of the human who had saved their mother's life and briefly been part of their extended family? The Castellanos compound was everything Agent Chen had described and worse. Hidden behind multiple layers of security fencing and electronic surveillance, the estate sprawled across a mountain valley that should have been home to wild elk and bears rather than serving as an elaborate prison for the entertainment of people wealthy enough to buy living creatures like luxury cars. Bobby joined the federal task force at a staging area 10 miles from the compound, where teams of wildlife specialists, veterinarians, and law enforcement officers prepared for what would be the largest illegal animal recovery operation in Colorado history. The scale of Castellanos' collection was staggering. 43 animals representing 16 endangered species, all held in enclosures designed more for aesthetic appeal than animal welfare. "Your wolves are in Enclosure 7, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the lead wildlife specialist, briefed Bobby as they reviewed aerial photographs of the compound. "It's designed to look like natural habitat, but it's surrounded by invisible electric fencing that delivers painful shocks to any animal that approaches the perimeter. They've been conditioned to stay in the center of the enclosure through repeated punishment." The psychological cruelty of this arrangement was almost worse than simple cages would have been. Luna's children had been given the illusion of freedom while being systematically trained to limit their own movement through fear of punishment, a form of mental conditioning that could take years to overcome even after their physical rescue. The raid began at dawn, with teams moving simultaneously to disable security systems, secure the human occupants of the compound, and begin the delicate process of safely extracting traumatized animals from enclosures they had occupied for months or years. Bobby's team was assigned to the wolf enclosure with instructions to sedate the animals if necessary, but to attempt verbal contact first in case they retained any positive associations with human voices. When Bobby first saw Luna's children through the camouflaged fencing of Enclosure 7, his heart broke completely. The magnificent young wolves he remembered had been reduced to shadows of their former selves, their gray coats dull and patchy, their proud postures replaced by the cowering stance of creatures who had learned to expect pain from their environment. They huddled together in the center of the enclosure, as far as possible from the invisible barriers that had taught them the boundaries of their artificial world. Their eyes held the flat, hopeless expression Bobby had seen in prisoners of war, the look of intelligent beings who had been systematically broken through prolonged psychological torture. "Luna," Bobby called softly, using the name he had given their mother. "It's me. It's Bobby. I've come to take you home." The response was immediate and heartbreaking. All 3 wolves raised their heads at the sound of his voice, their ears perking forward as some deeply buried memory stirred within their traumatized minds. The largest of the 3, a male who had inherited his mother's amber eyes, took a tentative step toward the fence before stopping abruptly, his body language showing the conflict between hope and the learned fear that had governed his existence for months. Dr. Walsh and her team worked quickly to disable the electric fencing, while Bobby continued talking to the wolves, using the same gentle tone he had employed during his months of building trust with their mother. Slowly, carefully, the young wolves began to approach, drawn by the familiar voice that represented safety and love in their earliest memories. When the barriers were finally down, Bobby entered the enclosure slowly, his hands empty and visible, his posture non-threatening. The reunion was tentative at first, with the wolves approaching cautiously, sniffing his scent and studying his face, as if trying to reconcile their traumatic recent experiences with older, happier memories. Then the largest male, apparently deciding that this human could indeed be trusted, approached Bobby and pressed his forehead against Bobby's chest in exactly the same gesture their mother had used after her rescue from the python. The other two wolves followed suit, and Bobby found himself surrounded by Luna's children, offering comfort to animals who had suffered because he had failed to recognize the danger that surrounded them. The extraction process took several hours as each animal was carefully examined by veterinarians and prepared for transport to specialized rehabilitation facilities. Luna's children would require months of psychological rehabilitation before they could be considered for potential release back into the wild, and even then, their chances of successful reintegration were uncertain after so much time in captivity. But as Bobby helped load the three wolves into specially designed transport carriers, he felt something he hadn't experienced since leaving the Wyoming wilderness: hope. These magnificent animals were alive. They were free from their captors, and they would have a chance to heal from the trauma that had been inflicted upon them by human greed and cruelty. The surprise came 3 days later when Agent Chen called Bobby at his motel with news that changed everything he thought he understood about his relationship with Luna and her pack. "There's something else," she said, her voice carrying an excitement that suggested significant developments. "We've been monitoring your old property since you left, keeping an eye on the pack's welfare during the relocation discussions." Bobby's heart clenched at the mention of Luna and the wolves he had abandoned. "Are they all right?" "More than all right," Agent Chen replied. "Bobby, Luna's new litter was born 2 weeks ago. 4 healthy pups." But that's not the remarkable part. She paused, apparently savoring the dramatic impact of what she was about to reveal. "The pack hasn't moved to the relocation site. They're still on your property, still maintaining their territory around your cabin, and Luna has been bringing her new pups to your porch every evening, as if she's waiting for you to come home." The image of Luna introducing her newborn children to the empty cabin where Bobby had once lived was almost too much to bear. Even after everything that had happened, Marcus's betrayal, the capture of her older children, Bobby's abandonment of the pack, Luna had maintained her trust in the human who had saved her life, continuing to consider him part of her family even in his absence. "There's more," Agent Chen continued. "The Federal Wildlife Service has decided to establish a permanent research station on your property, with you as the primary liaison between the scientific community and Luna's pack. If you're willing to return, you'd be working directly with legitimate researchers to document and protect the unique relationship you've developed with these wolves." Bobby stared out the window of his motel room at the urban landscape that had been his refuge from the pain of loss and failure. The offer represented everything he had thought was impossible: a chance to return to Luna and her pack, to be reunited with her rescued children once they completed their rehabilitation, and to ensure that the family bonds they had all formed would be protected rather than exploited. But it also meant facing the guilt and responsibility that had driven him into exile, accepting that his role in Luna's life came with obligations he could never again afford to ignore. "Agent Chen," Bobby said finally, his voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm him, "when can I go home?" Bobby's hands trembled as he turned the key in his cabin door for the first time in 3 months, the familiar creak of the hinges bringing back a flood of memories that threatened to overwhelm him completely. The interior was exactly as he had left it, dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunlight, streaming through windows that overlooked the clearing where Luna's pack had spent countless peaceful evenings. But the silence felt different now, pregnant with possibility and weighted with the knowledge of everything that had been lost and might yet be recovered. He had barely finished unloading his truck when Luna appeared at the edge of the tree line, her gray form materializing from the forest like a ghost returning to haunt the place where love had once flourished. She was thinner than Bobby remembered, her coat showing the strain of nursing and the stress of raising a new litter alone, but her amber eyes still held the intelligence and depth that had first captured his heart during their desperate encounter with the python. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the clearing that had once been the center of their shared world. Bobby felt the weight of his abandonment, the months of absence that had left Luna to face the challenges of new motherhood without the protection and support he had once provided. But when she began walking toward him, her movement was unhurried and deliberate, carrying none of the wariness he might have expected from an animal who had been abandoned by someone she trusted. Luna approached until she stood directly in front of Bobby, her eyes never leaving his face as she studied the changes that 3 months of guilt and isolation had carved into his features. Then, with the same grace that had marked their first meeting, she pressed her forehead against his chest, renewing the bond that had sustained them both through loss and separation. "I'm sorry," Bobby whispered, his hands gently touching the soft fur of her neck. "I should never have left you. I should have stayed and fought for our family." Luna seemed to understand his words, or perhaps she simply recognized the remorse in his voice. She stepped back and looked toward the forest, then back at Bobby, clearly communicating an invitation that needed no translation. She wanted him to meet her new children, to become part of their lives as he had been part of her previous litter before tragedy had torn them apart. The den was located in a new site, deeper in the forest and more carefully concealed than the previous location that Marcus's cameras had compromised. Luna led Bobby through a winding path between towering pines and rocky outcroppings until they reached a natural cave system that provided perfect protection for raising vulnerable pups. 4 tiny wolves emerged from the den at their mother's soft call, their eyes barely open and their movements still unsteady as they explored the world beyond their underground nursery. They were perfect in the way that only newborn animals can be, their gray fur soft and pristine, their small voices creating a symphony of squeaks and whimpers as they tumbled over each other in their eagerness to investigate this new human presence. Bobby knelt at a respectful distance, allowing the pups to approach him at their own pace, while Luna watched with the careful attention of a mother introducing her children to an extended family member. One by one, the pups overcame their initial caution and began exploring Bobby's boots, his hands, and eventually his face with the fearless curiosity that only the very young possess. The largest pup, a female with markings remarkably similar to Luna's, seemed particularly drawn to Bobby, climbing into his lap and settling there with the complete trust that spoke of Luna's influence in shaping her children's perception of this particular human. Bobby felt tears streaming down his face as he gently stroked the pup's fur, overwhelmed by the privilege of being accepted into this intimate family moment. "I won't let anything happen to them," Bobby promised Luna, his voice thick with emotion. "Not this time. Not ever again." The days that followed established a new routine that honored both the lessons learned from past mistakes and the hope represented by this fresh beginning. Bobby worked closely with Dr. Walsh and her research team to document the pack's behavior while implementing security measures that would prevent any future exploitation of their trust. Motion sensors and camera systems monitored the property's perimeter, but these were defensive tools designed to protect rather than survey, operated by people who understood the sacred nature of the relationship they were privileged to observe. Agent Chen visited regularly with updates on the ongoing prosecution of Marcus and his associates, as well as progress reports on the rehabilitation of Luna's rescued children. The 3 young wolves were responding well to treatment at a specialized facility in Montana, slowly recovering their natural behaviors under the care of experts who understood the complex psychological damage inflicted by prolonged captivity. "They're going to make it," Dr. Walsh reported during one of her weekly visits. "The trauma is significant, but wolves are remarkably resilient creatures. With time and proper care, they should be able to rejoin their family and live normal lives in the wild." The prospect of eventual reunion gave Bobby strength during the difficult moments when guilt and regret threatened to overwhelm his newfound happiness. Watching Luna's new pups grow and develop their personalities, seeing them learn to hunt and play and interact with their extended pack family, reminded him daily of what had been stolen from her previous children and what they might yet recover with patience and love. Marcus's trial became a landmark case in federal wildlife protection law, with his conviction resulting in a 15-year prison sentence and the dismantling of an extensive trafficking network that had operated across multiple states. But for Bobby, the real justice lay not in courtrooms, but in the evening gatherings when Luna's pack assembled in his clearing, their presence a living testament to the power of trust and loyalty to transcend the worst that humans could inflict. 6 months after Bobby's return, Luna's rescued children were finally deemed ready for reintroduction to their family. The reunion took place on a crisp autumn morning that reminded Bobby of the day he had first saved Luna's life, with federal wildlife officials and research teams maintaining respectful distances while the most important drama unfolded in the clearing outside Bobby's cabin. Luna recognized her older children immediately, despite the months of separation and the changes that trauma and captivity had wrought in their appearance and behavior. She approached them slowly, using the same gentle patience she had shown with her newborn pups, allowing them time to remember her scent and voice before gradually rebuilding the bonds that captivity had strained but never broken. The integration process took weeks, with the rescued wolves slowly learning to trust their natural environment again after months of confinement. But eventually, all 7 wolves, Luna, her 4 new pups, and her 3 rescued children, formed a complete family unit that roamed the wilderness around Bobby's property with the confidence and freedom that should have been their birthright. On quiet evenings, as Bobby sat on his porch watching the reunited family play and hunt and simply exist in the wild spaces they were meant to inhabit, he understood that some bonds transcend every attempt to break them. Love, it seemed, really could conquer all, even betrayal, even loss, even the terrible mistakes that haunt us when we fail to protect those who trust us most. Sometimes life gives us second chances when we least expect them, but most deserve them. Bobby Mitchell's story reminds us that the bonds we form through love and sacrifice can survive even our worst mistakes and deepest regrets. At 54, he had lost everything: his wife, his son, his faith in humanity, until a desperate wolf mother taught him that family isn't always about blood and loyalty doesn't always speak our language. When Bobby risked his life to save Luna from that python's deadly grip, he didn't just rescue a wild animal, he rescued his own capacity to love again. Through betrayal by his closest friend, the heartbreak of watching Luna's children stolen into captivity, and his own devastating decision to abandon the pack that trusted him, Bobby learned what many of us discover in our later years: that real love means showing up, especially when showing up is hardest. Luna never stopped believing in the human who saved her life, waiting faithfully for his return while raising new life in the wilderness they both called home. Their reunion proves that it's never too late to come home to the families we've built through kindness, sacrifice, and unwavering devotion. What relationships in your life have survived your worst mistakes? Have you ever experienced the kind of unconditional loyalty that transcends words? Share your stories of second chances and unexpected family bonds in the comments below.